You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter, anyone else that's interested, the theobspod is for you. Episode 103. 100 Years of Progress. Earlier this month, we celebrated the International Day of the Midwife, 5th of May. This is an annual event celebrating the important role of the midwife around the world. This year, the celebrations were a little bit special and are continuing beyond that single day to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the International Confederation of Midwives, the ICM. The theme, therefore, for the International Day of the Midwife was 100 Years of Progress. How much progress have we made in the last 100 years since the foundation of this organisation? A couple of my listeners suggested that this might be a great topic for an episode. And initially, when they suggested this topic, I thought it could be quite tough. There are moments when I question if we are indeed making progress. We're intervening more and more in what, after all, is a biological process, not a disease. We work in an area where our body is designed to do what we're overseeing, and this is in stark contrast to most medical and nursing specialties. Sometimes I can doubt and feel despondent at the increasing medicalisation and the so-called birth wars between different camps of opinion about birth. It can be draining and exhausting to be yo-yoing between camps that believe caesarean, medicalisation, hospitalisation are the only way, and camps that believe we've taken birth away from what it's supposed to be as a natural process. We're taking women's confidence away from their ability to birth their babies and be pregnant safely. But as I started to think a bit more about the topic, I realised 100 years is a long time. And there have been many great initiatives over that time, which have driven improvement and greatly improved outcomes for mothers and babies. So the more I started to think about 100 years of progress, the more I thought, yes, I'm going to do this. Some of my regular listeners will know I like to read. And so to prepare today, I thought I would dip back into one of my favourite books, Tina Cassidy, Birth, A History, and my lovely old second-hand Glasgow Manual of Obstetrics, which dates from the 1930s. As I flick through the Glasgow textbook of obstetrics, I realise that my job is unrecognisable compared with the day-to-day of my predecessors. There are pages upon pages listing different pelvic deformities due to rickets. This is described as a very common problem in pregnancy and childbirth. And there are some notes about the prevalence being 11% in the being cared for in Glasgow, with a comment that these sorts of pelvic deformity are more common amongst the poor. There are so many pelvic deformities that they're split into different categories, whether they obstruct the pelvic inlet or the outlet. And the distorted pictures make me realise just how lucky I am to practice in the 21st century. The book details how to attempt to measure the pelvis clinically, as well as desperate approaches to treatment, including preterm induction, with clear documentation that there's little chance of the baby surviving, and then, even worse, destructive operations to remove a dead baby once it has succumbed during an obstructed labour, so that you can save the life of the mother. This brings a very, very different day-to-day picture of work of my historical colleagues. In addition to these significant pelvic deformities, these obstetricians and midwives also had to deal with all sorts of unknown issues with the baby. There's a section entitled Abnormalities of the Fetus, Monsters, Single Monsters and Double Monsters. They're describing babies that have formed abnormally. And we're not talking about babies that these days would survive. These are babies with lethal abnormalities, the way their bodies have developed being incompatible with life. But in the era before ultrasound, we wouldn't know that. And these could risk the health of the mother by causing complications in labour and birth, despite the fact that actually the baby itself had no chance of survival. I've talked in more detail about the advent of ultrasound in the past on episode 20, Ultrasound, if you're interested in going back and understanding that in a bit more detail. So my 1930s colleagues were in some ways operating quite blindly. Another major progress in the last 100 years is the advent of antibiotics. Let us not forget that puerperal sepsis, still a killer today, was a major cause of maternal mortality in those days. There's an extensive list in the book of the different bacteria that can cause puerperal sepsis, alongside ominous signs as to how severe an infection might be. It then discusses prevention, things such as hand washing, sterilisation of equipment, and the very careful minimisation of trauma tearing, and the use of antiseptics liberally. But then it also talks about treatment. And some of the treatments are just baffling, really. There's a comment about intravenous antiseptics, the possibility of using serum or even blood transfusion as an antibacterial measure, despite the fact it can cause what's described as a very violent reaction. And there's an experiment detailed about the use of Streptococcus antitoxin, a serum developed from several strains of streptococci isolated from patients suffering from puerperal sepsis, being given a prophylactic dose to try and result in a fall in the number of septic cases. There is talk of isolation wards, isolating infected and suspected infected cases to prevent spread. use of calcium sulfide and halibut oil, as well as antiseptic solutions of a variety of different things to use in the vagina during pregnancy and labour. The book does comment that some of these may be positively harmful. The treatment possibly being worse than the cure. So you can see that our easy availability of antibiotics has been a game changer. So some of the things that have happened in the last 100 years are big changes in clinical practice. But there are also cultural changes as well. Amongst the many interesting chapters in Tina Cassidy's book, Birth, A History, she writes at the start of fathers being involved in childbirth. And this is certainly a major development in the last 100 years. Childbirth was always a predominantly female environment. She comments that it was only in 1962 that Bradley, an obstetrician at the Mayo Foundation, published Father's Presence in the Delivery Room, an analysis of his first 4,000 cases in which husbands were present through the birth as coaches. He described the doctor's role as resembling a lifeguard who, when watching the swimmers, did nothing as long as everything was going all right. Husbands were key to coaching. And she reports that it was 1962 before men were allowed into UK delivery rooms. Note the word allowed there. Does that mean we were actively keeping them out before that? In 1961, the BMJ published a letter from a man saying fathers should have the right to remain for births. Certainly, I remember growing up that my parents were proud of the fact that my father had been present at the birth of myself and my sister. It certainly wasn't a given for them, the man being present at the birth of his child. I would say there's therefore been a big stride of progress in recognition of the important role of fathers or partners bonding with their babies, being present with their partner at the birth of their child and the birth of that family, that unit, that united parenthood. Another obvious cultural shift has occurred with the increasing numbers of hospital births. Something, again, that has become far more commonplace in the last 100 years, especially in Britain with the advent of the NHS. The foundation of the NHS in 1948, potentially itself being a game changer for maternal and infant health. Everyone had access to healthcare, free of charge, regardless of their means. And certainly it seems likely that that influenced the start of what I feel is probably one of the most important marks of progress in the last 100 years, that of the confidential inquiries into maternal and child death. These were started in 1952, shortly after the birth of the NHS. It seems incredible to me that before that, maternal deaths were only reported on an ad hoc basis to the Ministry of Health. Maybe because they were more commonplace than they are now. But one cannot hope to improve things until one first measures them and knows what one is starting from. So that publication of the first report into maternal deaths in 1952 paved the way for high quality analysis and mandatory reporting of maternal deaths, which continue to this day. Many of us in the maternity world had some feelings of trepidation when the government put the confidential inquiries into maternal death and infant death out to tender. We were worried that this would prove a threat to an amazing system that had achieved great things. But fortunately for us, the Embrace reports have picked up where the confidential inquiry left off, taken up the mantle and continued their incredible work. If you want to understand the impact these reports have had, one only needs to look at the statistics. I've put in the programme notes a little review of the confidential inquiry into maternal death findings. There was a fall in maternal deaths due to abortion from 153 in the 1952 to 54 report to 1 in the 1994 to 99 report, attributable to the legislation of abortion. Food for thought as we look at other countries around us, such as Poland or the USA, that are considering once more making abortion illegal. Between the same periods, maternal deaths from hemorrhage fell from 188 to 9, and deaths from thromboembolism from 138 to 46. So over 40 years, this reporting, counting, and analysing has helped us make incredible improvements for mothers. And the KESDI reports, Confidential Inquiry into Stillbirths and Deaths in Infancy, also has achieved incredible things. Project 2728 looked at inquiry into the quality of care and the effects on survival of preterm babies born at 27 or 28 weeks. This was a major piece of work, identified patterns of practice and service provision that contributed to deaths, but also set out standards to make recommendations for the better care of preterm infants. During the study period, the neonatal mortality rate in that group was 12%. Now babies born at 28 weeks have a 96% chance of survival. And whilst the move from the Department of Health to putting these reports out for tender to Embrace has changed things slightly, it has continued to highlight the areas where we need to improve, currently with significant focus on health inequality, the disparity in outcomes between women and babies of different ethnic groups, as well as the importance of treating women with other underlying health conditions, both helping them plan their pregnancies and ensuring they get the right care during their pregnancies and after birth. Use of anti-D to prevent rhesus isoimmunisation is another big success story. It's very rare for us to see rhesus-negative women with antibodies these days, antibodies that potentially caused fetal anemia and stillbirth are really a thing of the past due to anti-D usage. Not all the changes in the last 100 years are good, of course. Whilst the advent of fetal monitoring may appear to be a useful tool to prevent brain damage from hypoxia, the continued debate about accuracy, interpretation, escalation, and the negative impact it has on women's birth, and the possibility of over-intervention due to concerns for fetal well-being, mean it remains a widely used but widely contentious tool. And there are many other things that we do that perhaps come in and out of fashion. This brings to mind, for me, my favourite Whose Shoes Mat X maternity experience scenario card called Changing Times. This was based on the experience of birth of my good friend Jill's lovely mum. And I'm delighted to say Jill has given me permission to share this lovely recording of her mum reading this card based on her own experiences.
When I gave birth, they insisted that I take castor oil, which always made me sick. And it did. What current midwifery practices do you think will seem wrong or odd to future generations?
And I think that sort of brings me to the end of this 100 Years of Progress episode. I think what I'm reflecting and learning from this is actually we have made great strides in improving care. The last 100 years has brought incredible progress in maternal and child health. And although we currently face fresh challenges, radically different from those encountered by our predecessors, with women having babies at an older age when maybe they have more pre-existing medical conditions or obesity, or women face the challenges of getting pregnant in the first place and having fertility issues, we can sometimes tie ourselves in knots, feeling stressed about intervention, taking things away from what our bodies are supposed to do. And it is absolutely right to think about those things and think about getting the balance back and make sure we're not pendulum swinging too far away from what would be ideally best for mothers and babies. When I look back over the 100 years, it seems we were very much, when I look back at that Glasgow textbook, focused on saving mothers' lives. And I can really see where the obstetric idea of mother before baby comes, because the mother's life is in peril with her obstructed labour, with hemorrhage, with puerperal sepsis. And we know, both from history and from fiction, that it was very accepted that childbirth was a dangerous time and that there was a significant chance of women dying. And that remains true in some less fortunate parts of the world. Let's not forget that. But perhaps our pendulum has swung a little bit too far the other way. Yes, of course, we need to think about the safety of the baby, and the safety of the baby is critical That is what every mother wants. She wants her baby to be safe. But in our attempts to try and improve safety for the baby and improve neonatal outcomes, we need to make sure that we're not doing physical or psychological harm to the women themselves. We need to maintain that careful, meticulous balance between mother and baby. Walk the tightrope. Make sure we're trying to do the best for both of them. And I think when I started in obstetrics, that was actually one of the things that I enjoyed about it. The idea that you start with one person and end up with two or more people. You're indirectly caring for more than one person at a time as that woman's baby grows and is born and comes into the world. So my zesty bit, I think, would be what Jill's mum, the lovely Joan, said.
When I gave birth, they insisted that I take castor oil, which always made me sick. And it did. What current midwifery practices do you think will seem wrong or odd to future generations?
Reflect on 100 years of practice. Yes. 100 years of progress. Yes. But perhaps sometimes wonder when people look back in 100 years' time, whether they will think what we're doing is odd, an aberration, or whether what we're doing will be seen as those great big strides, such as the confidential inquiry. We have an opportunity, as does every generation, to try and move things forward, to try and make that progress. So in your day-to-day work, think, what progress are you contributing to? I'd like to think that my contribution, and many people that I work with in the maternity experience community, might be moving from that paternalistic model to a much more autonomous model where women are deciding for themselves. We're providing information. We're acting as guides. We're providing our professional opinion, our knowledge and experience for the benefit of the women in front of us.
Remember that lifeguard analogy that I read earlier? We're standing by just in case something goes wrong. We're not interfering if the person's swimming absolutely fine. I very much hope you found this episode of the theobspod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the theobspod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at theobspod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.